I'm really happy to welcome Mr. Jonathan Gross, professor of English at DePaul University and author of many books. One of them, the European Byron, Mobility, Cosmopolitanism, and Chameleon Poetry. It will be released, what, tomorrow, Professor?
It was released on Monday.
On Monday.
September 15th.
Extremely fresh. And let me tell you about this book. It's a groundbreaking examination of Lord Byron's place in the wider European literary tradition, written by an accomplished scholar who has studied Byron's life and work for decades. This is not your first rodeo, not your first take on Byron. Let's talk about that, your fascination with this figure.
But this is my first interview on the book, and I think it's appropriate that it be with a Polish newspaper in Chicago, because I've fallen in love, really, with Polish culture by reading Adam Mickiewicz and studying Polish for 2 or 3 years with a tutor online.
Mm-hmm.
But my first book was on Lady Melbourne. It was called Byron's Corbeau Blanc, The Life and Letters of Lady Melbourne. And it was letters that he wrote when he was in his 20s to a 64-year-old woman, Lady Melbourne, after whom Melbourne, Australia is named, and Lord Melbourne, Queen Victoria's first prime minister. So Lady Melbourne turned out to be a brilliant woman who's appears in novels and plays. She appears in a Sheridan play as Lady Sneerwell, because she's such a sharp wit, and Byron, being very cynical, loved to learn about life from this woman. And he put it all in Don Juan. She appears as a character there in the English cantos. So she taught him everything he knew about love, and she was a beautiful woman. She's painted by Reynolds. So that was my first book on Byron's Corbeau Blanc. That was about 1997. And then I did a monograph called Byron the Erotic Liberal, which was about his politics and how they were influenced by his personal life, his love affairs, what that had to do with his ideas about politics, because he was the first person with Percy Shelley to edit The Liberal. And I argue that was the first use of the noun liberal in the English language.
Literature, wow.
So I'm going in depth here, and that finally led me to this. And I've been really blessed to have such wonderful scholars, Byron scholars from around the world, to support this kind of work.
Because this book, and it's a great thing you mentioned Adam Mickiewicz, because this book goes through so many ways that Lord Byron actually influenced Adam Mickiewicz's work.
Yes, and it's not really appreciated. We were talking a little bit about how people read these poets in high school, and it's separated by language. People think, oh, well, I don't know Polish, so I'm not even going to try to read Mickiewicz. And it's thanks to a 1947 translation by George Noyes, who was a minister in Berkeley, California. 1944, the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences published this translation. George Rappel Noyes, brilliant man, professor of Slavic languages at Berkeley, of all places, too. And there's so many connections. I mean, Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, Mickiewicz's Crimean sonnets. Wordsworth and Mickiewicz were doing the same thing. They were trying to make the language more romantic, less classical, moving from the decorum of Alexander Pope to a freer style. And Mickiewicz does that for the Polish language.
Professor, let's put them on a timeline.
Sure.
What's the age difference between the two of them, and when each one of them reached their peak, when they were the most famous?
Byron's born in 1788, dies in 1824, fighting for Greek independence. So that death becomes very important for Mickiewicz, because it is the time of his own exile in 1824, when he's exiled from Russia. The very year that Byron dies in Greece, Alexander Pushkin and Mickiewicz respond to that death.
So they were very familiar with Byron, with his works.
Yes, he says famously that he can only read Byron, Mickiewicz says, because he doesn't relish lies. And that's an extreme view, right? That all the other poets are lying, but Byron is telling the truth. And Byron's motto is Crede Byron, believe Byron. And as John Ruskin said, believe Byron, you always can. Ruskin's a controversial writer too, but he was one of the first to appreciate Byron.
Yeah. So there's a lot of parallels that you touch in your book. These Crimean sonnets are one of the most obvious ones. Let's talk about them for a second.
Yes, it's been common to dismiss writers sometimes as Orientalist, and this could be dismissed as Orientalism. But one way in which Mickiewicz, some critics say, improved upon Byron is that, and I don't think this is really true, but Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, and he accuses many of the Romantic writers of engaging in a textual attitude towards the East. But Byron and Mickiewicz visited the lands themselves, and the Crimean sonnets describe his trip on a boat discovering this place. And he makes the distinction between creating knowledge through your imagination and just learning things in books. And so he takes you through each sonnet. It's a brilliant compressed summary of his response to Crimea. Mm-hmm. And he would die there at the end of his life, so it was quite prophetic. The Crimean War was a very difficult war, but there was one particular poem that he wrote, The Grave of the Countess Potocki, or his sixth poem from the Crimean sonnet is called Bakhisare. Those hills of the Jireh, still vast and great, are galleries where desolation falls, these vari-colored domes, those crumbling halls where proud pashas upon rich divans sate, retreats of love and palaces of state. Here now the locust leaps, the serpent crawls. So that captures Romanticism. It's about ruins, visiting ruins, and whether it's the painter Turner or Delacroix capturing a lost time and bringing it back to life. That's what Childe Harold's Pilgrimage
drawing
did.
inspiration from those places.
Yes,
yeah.
Drawing inspiration from
them. Another thing is fight for nationalism, for independence. Obviously for Mickiewicz it was fight for Poland. Mickiewicz was the first generation actually of Poles who were born without a country. So obviously there was lingering, there was this burning fire, fight for independence, but Byron was also supporting that. We all know about his involvement with the Greeks, but he was all over Europe trying to ignite these nationalistic fires.
What's amazing about Byron, and it's exactly right what you're saying, is the poem Mazeppa, about a young man who has an affair with a Polish woman and is punished by being strapped to a horse that takes him to the Ukraine. And he eventually becomes the leader of Ukraine. But that youthful indiscretion captured Byron's imagination, adultery, having a relationship with a woman that you're not supposed to, but then being strapped to a horse and learning the discipline of the body, which is very Platonic, that you have to master your own passions in order to lead a country. So Mazeppa, and then Tchaikovsky writes the opera. And this is just typical of Byron. He never went, I don't believe, to Poland, of all the other countries he's been to, but he imagines it. And he captures the most interesting story and makes it fascinating. I think that's why Mickiewicz and others appreciated him.
Gallery is another very stark example, and Mickiewicz happily translated the Invocation. And obviously, Byron is writing about Greece, but when Mickiewicz translated that and put those words in Polish, all of a sudden, yeah, he's talking about Poland, about our fight for independence.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up. I was supposed to write a paper on his translation, and it proved so overwhelming, and I don't still feel up to the task yet. My language skills are not good enough, but people have said that it is an original poem. It's a translation, but it is an original poem in its own right. It's not a translation of Byron's poem so much as a reinterpretation of it. Okay. And some of the lines have been used in the Solidarity struggle. Famously, one or two were fixed to a monument and inspired workers in Gdansk at the shipyards. So the knowledge of the Polish people of Mickiewicz is amazing, that this would inspire them. And I think he's done that for revolutions in countries all over the world. But that's the most moving to me, is the Solidarity experience. To go all the way there, Byron again.
Several hundred years
yes.
forward, right? New realities, but the same ideas, the same principles.
And even more important, as you said, Mickiewicz, I think, is so important to the Polish language. He did so much with the language that there's great critics, historians, Norman Davies, God's Playground, 2 volumes,
wonderful,
masterful. Yeah. So that introduced me to all these things I'm mentioning now. So, and also I should say Professor Kalinowska at University of Warsaw is a major scholar of Romanticism. and her books have been very influential.
Byronic hero and several heroes in Mickiewicz's works, Konrad Wallenrod being the most obvious one, are also wonderful parallel.
I never knew that Joseph Conrad took his name from Konrad Wallenrod. So his father had named him after this hero, and Heart of Darkness was one of my favorite works, my father's favorite writer, Nostromo. I mean, just brilliant. And it was a second language. This is the amazing thing about Polish people, is to be one of the great English writers in a language that's not even your first language. Incredible achievement. But Konrad Wallenrod is treated in this book. I talk quite a bit about that. Because there's so many connections, fascinating connections. Mickiewicz knew American literature quite well.
Okay.
Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. When he was lecturing in French, again, an amazing thing, improvising his lectures at the College of France in Paris and making some of the first references to Ralph Waldo Emerson, transcendentalism, and also to the leather-stocking novelist, whose name I'm now going to blank on, but he wrote a book called The Spy. James Fenimore Cooper was a big influence on Mickiewicz.
Wow. I wonder, how were those poets thought? What shaped them? Because even though they lived in different countries, hundreds of miles apart, different realities, a different upbringing, but somehow they had this connection on some level. So I don't know, was it from the upbringing? Were they shaped by the same principles, same ideals?
Yeah, I think that what influenced him most was in Lithuania, in Vilnius, where he went to college. He was arrested as part of the Philomath Society. And so that was about free speech.
Yeah.
He quickly learned that you could get into trouble for saying the wrong thing. And that experience is in Forefather's Eve. He romanticizes himself as Gustav, who then changes his name. The death of this young figure he becomes somebody else. Through this act of writing on the prison wall, he writes his name, and it's like a tombstone, like William Blake, or Resurrection. It's an unbelievably imaginative work, Forefather's Eve. It's one of the most imaginative. George Sand praises it. Goethe thought it was better than Byron's Manfred. George Sand was a great appreciator of Mickiewicz. And it's been translated recently into the US and so on, but whenever it's been produced, it's had revolutionary effects. In 1968, the Soviets tried to shut it down because it led to Polish nationalism. Yeah.
But what I'm looking at are the parallels between Byron and Mickiewicz. Were they shaped in the same way? Were they reading the same things growing up? Were they looking at the world the same way? How do you think?
Well, you bring to mind that translation. I mean, Mickiewicz was angry having to translate Byron's Giaour.
Yeah.
It was a key moment where he goes, "Oh, that English rake, busy doing this," and so he's imitating. Some say, and I don't think it's fair, but he is imitating Byronic attitudes. Even the famous portrait of him, I'm getting the name right, the famous Polish painter, he's shown in the Crimean sonnets, on the very last Crimean sonnet, posing in a Byronic style with that profile. So the attitudinizing, we could call it, striking a pose, as you said before, the support for Napoleon. These were things you did. Byron writes Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte. Mickiewicz makes Napoleon very important to Tadeusz, as you were mentioning. Key figure. So I think it's Byron, then influenced Mickiewicz and Pushkin, and they carry the torch forward.
Awesome. I was surprised that you found some traces of Byronic influence in Tadeusz. It's an epic so rooted in Polish reality, in that Lithuanian countryside, that I thought that there's no way that some Englishman could put his fingerprint somewhere there.
Yeah, you may be right about that, actually. It's difficult to know what the influence is. One big difference, as you've just said, is that Tadeusz has a more classical, Homeric feel to it. That it's not a romantic epic in that sense, except that it celebrates the landscape of Lithuania, mushroom picking, and the trees, which is very Wordsworthian. In some ways, it's a more Wordsworthian epic, like the Prelude, Wordsworth's Prelude, than it is Byronic.
But the Telemena, is that the term? The
Yes.
Aunt Telemena, cynical, worldly, very much like Lady Melbourne, a woman who's had affairs, and she's contrasted with Zosima.
Zosia.
Yes, and that contrast between beauty, they're both beautiful women, one a woman, one a girl. She is very much like the characters in Don Juan, because Don Juan is about a 16-year-old boy who falls in love with older women, one after the other, like the story of Joseph in Genesis.
Yeah.
And he's tempted, and he goes around the world falling in love and getting kicked out of one country after another. First Spain, and then Istanbul, and the Sultana falls in love with him, then Catherine the Great. And he's just sort of a tool of women, a kind of playboy used by women, really, as Byron felt he was. Not sure that's quite true. But one big difference there is that Byron was also, he had a club foot. He was, we would say, handicapped or disabled.
Yes.
But Mickiewicz, of course, didn't have this.
Mickiewicz was, I was told, was big and strong, and his stature was imposing on other people. So he was, in sense, total opposite to Byron, who had to live with his disfigured foot from the beginning. And I bet he was bullied badly in school.
He was overweight.
He was,
He was even obese. His mother was obese. He came up from a broke. His father was not there. His mother brought him up, Catherine Byron. He's half Scottish, half English, and it's the Scottishness, that flighting tradition of abuse and invective that goes back to the 16th, 17th century, where you fight with words. So he loved Alexander Pope. He was really a neoclassical writer. Yeah. He's not like Keats, not a Wordsworth, or Blake. He mocked these people. He said, "Oh, this is just garbage." You know? He loved Coleridge. But you're really right when you say that about Ponte de Ojo. And it's a very good question, because it's an epic. And why is it like Don Juan? Well, it's about the rise of a young man who has building his roman. He has an education like Tom Jones, and he learns about the ways of the world. And the real Byronic figure probably is the Count.
Yes.
That foppish figure.
Yeah, because while Don Juan is centered around one person, in Ponte de Ojo, it's hard to find this one main character. It's a collection. It's more about the interaction and the landscape in which those characters have to operate, more than these individual experiences of one person.
Yes, I have a chapter in which I do a close reading, and this is thanks again. I want to make sure I'm getting this name right, because I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to make mistakes. And one mistake I do not want to make is honoring a professor I met at a conference in Greece, and she specializes in Philhellenism. Her name is Maria Kalinowska, and she invited me to speak at the University of Warsaw on December 4th, which was the day my father was born, actually, so I always remember that. But he died recently, so to speak on his birthday in Poland meant a lot to me. She graciously put me up there and introduced me to people who knew a lot more about all of this than I did. One scholar there, Maria Janian, I don't know but her daughter, I believe, if I've got it right, was a scholar of Poland, and I learned a lot. I gave a talk on music in Ponte de Ojo, and I became convinced that that's an important theme. All the grasshoppers, the frogs, they sing, and he's
obviously the Yankel's concert when he's playing, and Mickiewicz so masterfully tells the story of Yankel's music.
Yes, and that is, there's an illustration.
Yes.
It's one of the only few philo-Semitic portraits of a Jewish figure who's a tavern keeper, who might be not a spy so much as someone who tries to calm people down, wait till Napoleon comes. What would be the right time to commit this, to declare ourselves? And in the end, he's right about that. But he's a very interesting figure. He plays an instrument that took me a long time to research as well. His concert at the wedding is an allegory of the coming together of Poland and all its diversity, and Frankism and all the different groups. Yeah,
and that gives I think Mickiewicz opportunity to convey that allegory in the best way. It's like, okay, let's pause and let's have this aria, like in opera. The time stops, and I'm gonna tell you what I really want to tell you, using Yankel's music.
Almost like Orpheus, or
exactly.
the bringing together of all the animals, and the sounds. the one Byronic part about the poem is that making fun of names. He pairs people and mocks their names, as Byron does of the Russian names in Don Juan, and has fun with it. It's serious, but it's not without levity. The comic touch, yeah.
So Mickiewicz is revered in Poland. This is symbol. He rose to a monumental status in Poland. I was told that Byron is the same in Greece. Is that the case?
Absolutely. You see statues to him in Athens, and people name their sons Viranos.
So that's a Hellenized version of
Byron.
His last name.
And there's another very important person who built a museum on the occasion of his 200th anniversary of his death. Rosa Floru. I brought students from DePaul there, several students, to visit the place where he died in Missolonghi, fighting the Turks near the Gulf of Lepanto. But he died of a fever in Missolonghi. And she has built a wonderful museum to honor Byron's death in Missolonghi, in the holy city of Missolonghi, where many people died fighting for Greek independence, and he inspired them. As he said, "I've come to electrify the troops." But he put it in quotation marks. He had a sense of irony that he was something a little bit foolish. He even sent 3 Homeric helmets in pink boxes. So the British mocked him at the time. Many of them still do. And there's a wonderful scholar, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐮, Byron's Politics, that shows us the layers of irony behind this. Yeah.
His story is a story of rise and fall.
Yes.
He came from nothing, achieved a height for 2-3 years. He was a toast of London salons. Everybody wanted to be with him, touch him, talk to him, and then totally collapsed. And that was a tail end of his story, that escape to Greece, right?
That's really well put, because people would say, "Oh, he's a child of privilege," and he calls himself the spoiled child of fortune. But he only became a lord at 10. He was impoverished before then. He lived in Scotland.
His father, when he died, he dumped all his debt on young Byron and his mother. So,
right. So he's the product of a single home, single parent, and he battled his way through. He was always in favor of the underdog for that reason. He went to Harrow, then he went to Cambridge, but he didn't do particularly well. He made fun of pompous professors, and he had great charisma and very good looks, which didn't hurt. So he charmed people, and he wrote beautiful letters to his mother, Catherine Byron, from abroad.
But that relationship, I thought, was broken in so many instances, and he still wrote beautiful letters to her?
Yes, she loved him, but she suffocated him, and he was embarrassed of her, and she was proud of him, and he ran up bills in college, and she drove him. He drove her crazy. He just wouldn't behave himself, and she was nervous, but she began to see, I think, that he really had potential. John Hobhouse was his companion, who traveled with him.
Yeah.
Everyone tried to help him. Thomas More, the Irish writer, Thomas More, visited him in Greece. But you asked that question about monuments, and I saw so many Mickiewicz monuments throughout Poland.
Yes.
It was wonderful. Warsaw,
yes.
And then one in Krakow.
He's everywhere. And we have these 𝐶 3 really prominent romantic poets. He was the greatest of them, and he actually brought the Romanticism to Polish literature. He actually taught Poles how to think in this brave new era, and I think behind his name a lot of fight, especially on the intellectual level, for Polish independence happened. He was a cornerstone, a foundation of what happened several decades later when Poland regained independence. So we owe him a lot of respect. Those monuments are, in the right spot, in the right place.
Yeah, some people wonder why not Krasinski or Slovacky.
What
Slovacky. So what was it about Mickiewicz? And Peter Cochrane has written on this, and there's a professor at University of Gdansk who is also translated. The book is called Poland's Angry Romantic. And I was introduced, Bill Johnston, as a translator. So these translations of Polish poetry are very important because they remind us that there's many of other Polish writers to study. And I was quite embarrassed at the age of 50 to realize I didn't know anything about Polish literature.
Yeah, we were always wondering, how is Polish literature received? Are there scholars who go through the pains of reading that material, comparing it to literatures of other countries. And I was so happy, honestly, Professor, when I found you and your work and this book, that you dedicate a good portion of it to analysis of relationship between Byron and Mickiewicz.
There was much more that I could have done and should have done. The Crimean Sonnet should have been in there. But I was also interested in the friendship of Pushkin and Mickiewicz. I found that fascinating, that I believe Mickiewicz presented Pushkin with Byron's complete works. So that was something they shared. And even though they fell out, it's a lesson, I think, for our times to think about that they had great things in common. There were Soviet postcards of Mickiewicz and Pushkin in front of the Bronze Horseman. And I'm sure you know this and everybody in Russia knows this, but Americans don't quite always realize since the Cold War that there was a rapprochement, that there were things in common, and that Konrad Wallenrod was performed in St. Petersburg with the music of Maria. I'm going to make mistakes because some of this is quite new to me. But Le Murmure, she was a pianist who really impressed Goethe, and you can hear her music online. On Apple, on Spotify. Brilliant. She was a composer. She traveled with her daughters, and she became Mickiewicz's mother-in-law. She also introduced Chopin to his audience when he was 10 years old. But there's no record of that.
Yeah. It is amazing how all those people actually knew each other and interacted with each other.
And inspired each other.
Inspired each other, exactly. I wonder if they were competing on some level also.
You know, I'm so impressed with the, I don't want to call it drawing room culture, but women at this time enabled civilized exchanges. And if it wasn't for these salons and the salonists, it's not clear. The men would be throwing each other out the window. I think there's an example of that. Mickiewicz apparently got so angry with a fellow Polish poet that he threw him out the window, the story goes. And there was a lot of ego between the men, as there obviously is. But there's the civilizing influence. I mean, Goethe says, the eternal feminine leads us on high. I think it's maybe the last line of part 2 of Faust. He also has a character based on Byron in Faust. Goethe and Mickiewicz met, but they didn't speak the same language. But they were impressed by each other, and so I'm so impressed by Europeans, all the languages they know, and you can read Mickiewicz in the original. I'm moving towards it, I hope. But I think that Le Murmure, I really want to mention that beautiful piece of music because she was called Hummel, Hummel, I believe. It is a very well-known German composer. And so she was compared to men, but women were not treated seriously as original writers, but she did write music.
Yeah. When we are taught about Byron, we in Poland we just skim it. We just go through it, you know, in a fraction of one lesson. That's pretty much it. It doesn't give him justice. But let me ask you about our understanding of Byron now. Do we get him better than previous generations, or do we still look at him as this scandalous, sexually frivolous man who racked the salons, not just in London, but across the Europe?
It's a great question, and I think that Byron was translated into French, something I didn't realize. So he was read by Europeans in the French language, by Pichot's translation, P-I-C-H-O-T. So Pushkin knew French better than he knew Russian. Both poets, Pushkin and Mickiewicz, created the language in which they wrote for literary work. That sounds like a bit of an exaggeration, but apparently, is true. So I think a lot of people like Byron because he was handsome. A lot of people fall in love with him because he's charismatic. Oscar Wilde, there's a certain cynicism. There are some people also who are drawn to him because of his bisexuality, by his willingness to love and write poems to young men as well as women. And so we've learned a lot from him. He had charisma. And I think there's nothing wrong with falling in love with him for any of these reasons. I just studied him at Haverford College with Leonard Goldberg, was my professor, just because of the red binding of the book, the Cambridge edition. I thought, I love the name of Lord Byron, so there's something very romantic about him and his story. And I think anything that appeals to you about him is certainly valid.
I heard an interesting story I don't know if that's true. I want to verify that he met Percy Shelley and his wife, Mary Shelley. Mary obviously wrote the Frankenstein. Is it true that Byron inspired the modern way of perceiving vampires as these super handsome, little withdrawn, sexually unpredictable men?
Well, my wife, Pia Pawlopinski, has written a book on the we'll be writing a book on this subject, but she's also written on the Ottoman Empire, and she's able to trace a lot of this back to his visit to Smyrna and to grave sites in Turkey, and his knowledge of this. Now, he's falsely attributed, John Polidori wrote The Vampire, but it was attributed to Byron. But there is a vampiric scene in the Giaour at the opening where Greece is like a woman that is about to be consumed by a vampire. Okay. The vampire mythology is quite interesting, and he disowns this. I've got nothing to do with this. He writes to his publisher, John Murray. I don't know.
So he was aware of it.
Oh, he was aware of it because he was always being translated. He didn't like the French translation of his works, but it made him very popular. And with vampires, it's quite similar. I teach Dracula, and it's Bram Stoker's novels, really rich. I think he just has the kind of imagination. He also wrote a fragment of a tale called The Vampire, about 3 or 4 pages in prose. He was going to write a novel, and it's rich. It's about a double identity, a doppelganger. One person's living in London, and the other person is in Istanbul, I believe, at the same time. So everything he wrote was just so rich, and I guess that helped other writers to think about this. When you think about blood, I don't want to become controversial here. It was a way of, in Don Juan he talks about cannibalism, and he compares it to the blood of Christ, blasphemously. He has scenes that are quite, people are starving on a boat, where is God? And this kind of thing. So the vampire mythology speaks to some of this idea of pre-Christian. Lithuania, I believe, was the last pagan country to convert to Christianity. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, you're right. And the symbol of blood, our relationship with blood is totally different than back then, than the 19th century, when blood was repeatedly drawn from sick people. Even Byron probably died sooner because those procedures done by him. But it's funny how the perception of different things, how a symbol carried by different things changes over time.
Yes, leeches, exactly. And porphyria is a blood disease that George III died of. So that, and the idea of blood descent or bloodline aristocracy was being changed and thought about more skeptically. The Bourbons, an old, mad, blind, and dying king is the opening line of Percy Shelley's England in 1819, which is about princes as the dregs of their civilization, not something to look up to. Napoleon is a man of merit. The person, though quite short, and Corsican, and not French really, comes in as a usurper, takes over the country and leads it. And now he's a symbol of France. In some ways, he rebuilt the whole city. So that idea of an outsider, a usurper, I think is interesting. That's the cosmopolitan theme, and mobility, and chameleonism, which I take from Keats's poem, the idea of the chameleon poet, a person who takes the colors of the country that he's living in and adopts it.
That's the mobility factor, right?
Yeah, mobilité is the French word.
Yeah.
He describes this as sympathy, empathy, empathizing so much that you become them.
Yeah, awesome. Professor, while researching this book, you had you spent countless hours studying Polish literature. You visited Poland a number of times. You spoke with a lot of Polish researchers. What is your perception of modern Poland? The country that you visited, the people you spoke with?
Oh, I was so impressed by the food, the pastries. You go to Starbucks here, and you go to a Polish bakery, and the smells and the charm. I saw people dancing, I think at midnight in Krakow, doing tango lessons in a park, things that just took my breath away. The beauty of Krakow. There was a conference there. I'm going to mispronounce it. Jagielloński University. Yes, the university. Yes, Copernicus and the history of solidarity, the Gdansk, the beauty of the shipyards, the fact that that was the beginning of World War II, that was the city that was attacked and changed, and was an incredible education, and then Warsaw. I felt like I was traveling back in time. It taught me so much about World War II, and I think at the time that I visited, the Americans were going to celebrate that day, and it didn't happen. But I learned a lot about the Polish spirit. It was really moved to see how long the Polish people waited for their freedom and weren't treated very well, I don't believe, in World War II. And by the Allies afterwards. It was very painful to read about that. But even the more, to see these Polish writers, Kastorp, I think is the name of one novel I read. I started to read modern Polish. Yes, and Polish poets. Polish poetry is so vibrant. So it's been great. And the beauty of the music. I went to some Chopin concerts.
Beautiful.
You can walk right in, and you don't have to book ahead. And they're so welcoming, and they're played in churches.
Yes.
And the palaces, of course. I couldn't believe the beauty of the places that I visited, and the public transportation system works well. People are very friendly.
Super. Thank you so much, Professor. I know this book is just published, but I bet you're thinking ahead about your next project, what it's going to be about.
Thank you for asking, by the way, and thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure.
This is the first interview I've done, and I'm, again, very touched to be doing this for your publication. I was interested in graffiti. I still am. I did a book called The Words of the Prophets, graffiti in Poland, Italy.
Words of the Prophets, like in Sound of Silence.
Yes, exactly. The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls, which is a biblical reference. And the idea being that people express their protest through graffiti, through writing. And I'm from New York City, so they did this through aerosol paint, and a lot of Latino artists, brilliant people. Lady Pink is one, but Lee Quinones. I was just in Los Angeles recently, and the protest against the government and just protests generally. It started with the shipyards. There was a lot of graffiti there. And there's graffiti, there's a person called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐮. There's a woman in Gdansk.
It goes back to Roman Empire. And the first graffitis, first words were written right there. And he was prosecuted by the Roman authorities when people spoke against them. Those were very vulgar, much more vulgar than what we see right now.
And that word vulgar is a very interesting word, vulgarity. Yeah. My students always bristle when I say that because it sounds so snobby. But Jane Austen refers to people as vulgar. Or Madame de Staël called Jane Austen vulgaire, très vulgaire. Wow. To call Jane Austen vulgar is but what is
from
vulgar?
This perspective,
But it is vulgar to paint private parts.
Yeah, for example.
For example, in Pompeii, they're still there. Yeah. But I think it also shows you the richness that what we think of as vulgar and uneducated, like graffiti, might well be more sophisticated than we even know. And the alphabet, for instance. Henry Chalfant went to Stanford, studied classics, and he started taking photographs of graffiti because it reminded him of the Greek language, that people were taking these letters and turning them into works of art. The alphabet suddenly was dancing. Someone said that Mickiewicz, were he born today, would have been a rapper.
For sure, exactly. You know what I heard? That they met with Słowacji and Chopin was playing music, improvising, and the two of them were going at each other, not necessarily rhyming, but also improvising with their words. Can you imagine being in that place, in that French salon in Paris, and being witness to those three creative titans going at each other?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. He is the great improviser, improvisation. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was an Italian improviser. Pushkin declaimed, and in this book I have a famous painting of Mickiewicz standing up and improvising, and this is what impressed Pushkin. Byron couldn't do it. And even today, the Academy sometimes says, oh, what's improvisation? That doesn't count. It's what you write down, but that's wrong because we know that Homer was an oral poet, and so is Mickiewicz. So my next project will probably be on graffiti, maybe even the three great Polish poets. I'm interested in the three great Mexican muralists, Siqueiros and Rivera, and most interesting of all is the person who did in Pomona College, Orozco, Prometheus. And that's a poem by Byron. So it does connect if we allow ourselves to look around and be open to it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Professor, thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. We probably could go
We
on
could. This has been so much fun.
another hour and find new subjects, new topics to cover. The European Byron, Mobility, Cosmopolitanism, and Comedian Poetry is the newest book by Professor Jonathan Gross. Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope I didn't bore your audience. And I hope you could
hope
follow what
so
I was saying.
Too, because we are
appreciate it.
both guilty of something.
I don't think so, though. I think
Thank you,
people will
Professor.
appreciate it. Thank you.